everyone. I'm Ashley Klein Jimenez with Prevent Connect, a project of Valor US, and I am here with my colleague, Tori Vandeland. Tori, thanks for joining me to continue our conversation about Child Abuse Prevention Month and Sexual Assault Awareness Month.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ashley. I really enjoyed our previous conversation and happy to be back and continuing talking about this.
Thanks, Tori. Me too. In our previous conversation, we did talk about the overlaps of child abuse and sexual violence, and we discussed some of the resources around preventing child sexual abuse and some of the work that we are familiar with. But for this conversation, I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about some of the more recent developments in preventing child sexual abuse, that we're aware of, and think about where we go from here.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great idea. And, we love to be forward thinking and future thinking in prevention. So I know one of the things that happened pretty recently, like just before the COVID-19 pandemic started, was the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released a report to Congress on child sexual abuse, and it led to some funding changes. So we're actually going to hear from David a little bit about, what went on with that.
In the fall of 2019, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued a report to Congress on child sexual abuse prevention. This was an important report because what it did is it highlighted the existing literature of being able to describe how childhood sexual abuse is a public health problem and how child sexual abuse is both a substantial problem and a preventable problem. And they talked about what was known and what are the gaps and what can be done around preventing child sexual abuse. From this report, it's been very helpful to be able to understand what's moving on and finding ways to advance. Subsequently, Congress has allocated in fiscal year 19, $1 million, and in fiscal year 20, $1.5 million to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention towards child sexual abuse prevention. As we are seeing more of these efforts to be able to do this, we are expanding what we know and we're finding better ways to implement it. And here at Prevent Connect, we've been really dedicated to having that conversation to continue to learn more about child sexual abuse prevention. April is both Sexual Assault Awareness Month and Child Abuse Prevention Month. This is a time for us to pay attention to the issue of child sexual abuse and how we can be able to prevent it and what we can do to be able to make a difference. This is a problem that's pervasive throughout our society, but it is something that can be prevented. So let's look. I want to just highlight some of the resources that we've been doing here at Prevent Connect to be able to help support all those efforts to prevent child sexual abuse.
It was really great to hear from David and hear about the increased investment in child sexual abuse prevention. Investing in child sexual abuse prevention strategies and dedicating other resources to the issue is really so critical. We actually had a chance last month to talk with the authors of a new desk guide for preventing child sexual abuse in youth-serving organizations. And that desk guide really offers a bit of a shift in how organizational leaders can help create protective environments for children. Tori, I'm wondering if you'd talk a little bit about our conversation for those who may not have listened to that podcast.
Yeah, of course. So we had a conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau and Dr. Keith Kaufman, who are two of the authors of that desk guide that you had mentioned. And so it's meant to be like a supplement to what folks are already doing to prevent child sexual abuse in youth serving organizations. They made a really strong point of like youth serving organizations do a lot. They're responsible for a lot. And for the most part, youth serving organizations are a really safe place for youth. So what are some other things that they can add to existing policies and practices to ensure youth safety. And we know that there are a ton of policies and practices that youth serving organizations do in order to keep their youth safe. So it's also, examining, like, when we say youth serving organization, we talked about this on our first episode. That means so many different things. And even the organizations that fit really, really neatly into that youth serving organization box are so unique from one another. So what I really appreciate about this desk guide and the conversation that we had with Elizabeth and Keith was talking about, you have like a huge list of things that people say will prevent child sexual abuse in youth serving organizations. But knowing that each organization is different from one another, sometimes it's really helpful for folks, and this is what the desk guide does, is to bring it back to what's your overarching goal for child safety? What's an overarching framework that folks can identify and work with that promotes youth safety, that you can build your policies and practices around there too? So I really appreciated that when they were talking about the guide, when they made the desk guide, they really made it to be really adaptable too. We were talking a little bit about, nobody was really predicting what was going to happen in the last year. But when we have resources like this desk guide that are really adaptable, they can help organizations be, flexible and nimble to respond to these changing environments too. So not only is it something that can be adapted, organization to organization because they're so different from one another, but also as time progresses. Keith had a really great example of, like that shift in like when parents had to start asking safety questions around how often are adults on their cell phones. Like that's something that 15 years ago may not have been like one of the first safety questions that a parent would ask, but these days is probably one of the top safety questions that a parent would ask. So I really enjoyed hearing about how the guide helps organizations now and will help organizations be flexible as like this unpredictable context continues to change.
Yeah, thanks for that summary. And I really appreciated the discussion around that kind of what are your overarching goals for safety. We talked a little bit about there are things that organizations can do to promote safety beyond just some of these like prescriptive policies or rules that we so often put in place. And so I thought that conversation was so important because, like you're saying, not every organization is the same. In fact, when we say that you can think about youth serving organizations so broadly, and it could really fit so many different kinds of organizations or programs, then you absolutely do need a framework that can adapt and that folks can fit to their culture and what makes sense for their environments. So I really enjoyed that conversation. I think it was 4 parts, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was a long conversation, but it was really good and very informative too. And what I also really appreciate was that, like, throughout the document and our conversation, there's an acknowledgement that yes, like these prescriptive policies have also provided a lot of safety for youth, have prevented violence before. And also there's more that we can do, right? There's that overarching framework on top of those prescriptive policies as they fit within the organization that really, what I felt was like, okay, so this is the piece, like this is the missing piece from like policy and culture change.
Yep. Yeah, I totally can see that. I agree.
So that podcast is in 4 parts on our website. So we will make sure that folks have links to all 4 of those parts, as well as the desk guide to, use at your own discretion, share with folks. So Ashley, we've talked about, what's happened recently. I wonder if we can shift a little and think about what the future would look like, what we envision for the future. What do you think it will take to prevent child sexual abuse?
This is a really big question, but I think as big as it is, it's also just that important. And Tori, I shared, my own experiences in life with our colleagues, and I've shared some of them on Prevent Connect web conferences. And one thing that I really believe is that based on those experiences, if we can prevent child sexual abuse, we'll likely prevent other forms of violence later in life, as well as mitigate some of those negative health outcomes that we way too often see. And so I really love that we're having more and more conversations around the issue of health equity, but I don't think we can have health equity as long as child sexual abuse exists in our world. Child sexual abuse is a health equity issue. And something I've been thinking about a lot recently is how policies and the environments that we create impact children and young people and their vulnerability to experiencing sexual abuse. So, for example, there has just been a string of legislation across the country targeting transgender children. And there are so many, reasons why these bills, these policies are harmful, but also sends a message that their existence isn't valid. And we know that is just incredibly dehumanizing and isolating. So these really disturbing and dangerous environments that are being created, I feel like the strategies to prevent child sexual abuse really have to recognize those things, and we have to be committed to counteracting these messages.
Absolutely, Ashley. And, thank you for bringing up that really timely and horrific legislation that's happening. I feel like it's so important to talk about when we have these conversations about child sexual abuse. It's so counteractive to what is needed to create safe environments for all youth and children. And also, you talked about earlier about, it's not just like the child sexual abuse that we're looking at. It's preventing that. And by preventing that, we're also preventing those negative impacts across someone's life. When we think about this, I think a lot about how, still predominantly people think that child sexual abuse is an isolated incident or a, air quote, family matter. And it's so held to this norm of silence that allows this violence to continue occurring, that allows child sexual abuse to continue to occur. But I think if we zoom out a little bit, we can see, like you had just mentioned, there are so many things in our culture that contribute to violence and violence against youth and child sexual abuse. And I really think it's our responsibility as preventionists to make those connections between different types of violence, which includes child sexual abuse, and the forms of oppression that are the root causes. With what you just shared, I feel, what, like you had said, it's dehumanizing. It makes youth feel like their existence isn't valid or that they don't matter. And that absolutely contributes to the social norms that uphold violence. I also think about how these systems of oppression create barriers to prevention and inequitable child sexual abuse prevention. Who gets resourced to do this work? What communities get resourced? What communities get to participate in research too? To kind of drive the future of prevention. And I mean, I think like along that thread, I think a lot about how so much of child sexual abuse prevention from my knowledge, focuses a lot on like bystander intervention and parent and child education, like teaching children anatomically correct names for their body parts, things like that, which like that is great and absolutely needed and is prevention and does prevent child sexual abuse. But when we look at child sexual abuse as a systemic problem, which it is, we also require systemic solutions and prevention at that level too. You know, what would it mean for child sexual abuse prevention if white supremacy didn't exist? What would it mean for child sexual abuse prevention if heterosexism and cissexism didn't exist? What about if poverty didn't exist? There's a lot of ageism with child sexual abuse and a culture of silence. So if that didn't exist, you know, how would that impact child sexual abuse and its prevention? I think especially right now, thinking about, you know, what would it mean for child sexual abuse prevention if kids didn't grow up watching kids who look like them get murdered by police or watching politicians and adults argue about their own humanity? All of these things that cause sexual violence and child sexual abuse are also harmful in and of themselves, not just in their relation to child sexual abuse. So it's a really expansive way to think about violence prevention in general and specifically child sexual abuse too. And that gives me a lot of hope that folks are thinking more expansively about preventing violence across the lifespan and preventing all forms of violence. And where I see this come up a lot is like this like renewed and emerging energy around preventing ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, because a lot of the root causes of violence are also adverse childhood experiences too. And I think that helps open the door a little bit more for health equity. And then also, you know, I think it's really encouraging to see expanded efforts around age appropriate, comprehensive, holistic, inclusive, all of that in sexuality education too, because we know from research and practice that that is such a key piece to preventing both perpetration and victimization of sexual violence and child sexual abuse.
Gosh, Tori, wow. Yes, I mean, yes to all of that. You made so many good points, and I am just like, my wheels are turning thinking of all of the conversations that we've had recently on Prevent Connect and how they really tie into all of these points that you're making. And then also just ideas for other conversations that I'd love to bring to our audience, because we always say there's so much wisdom with the folks who participate in our web conferences, and I just would love to get their insights and experiences to all of this. I think, Tori, when we talk about creating protective environments or increasing health equity, the ultimate goal is that children are able to grow up in safe, supportive, thriving environments where all aspects of their identities are celebrated, right? Like not just validated, but celebrated. And we're to then move through life, move through their lifespan, being able to really reach their full potential. And so I think that I love that, you made a lot of those connections to the systemic and oppressive root causes, and then also shared some of what you're encouraged by and where your hope is. April is a really important month for us to be able to highlight these connections and bring people who might not already be involved into the conversation. But we know that this is not something that we're going to figure out in a month, that one conversation isn't going to get us any closer to where we need to be. And so, I feel pretty confident in saying that at Prevent Connect, we are dedicated to making these connections all year round. Thanks for having this conversation today, Tori. I really appreciate all of your insight, and am honored to do this work with you.
I am too. I'm really honored to, do this work with you and have these conversations on our platform with Prevent Connect. And I think we're both going to hold each other accountable to continuing these conversations year round. So looking forward to it. Thanks for listening. Follow along with other Prevent Connect podcasts at preventconnect.org/podcast.